Harold's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the black leather. The Rolls-Royce purred beneath him, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside his chest. At 68, he'd been driving for the Blackwell family longer than his current employer, Brandon, had been alive. Yet here he was, fighting to keep his composure as another barrage of insults assaulted his ears. "For God's sake, Harold, can't this thing go any faster? I swear your driving is as slow as your brain these days." Brandon Blackwell sneered from the back seat, his voice dripping with disdain. Harold's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the young tycoon's scowl. He bit back a retort, instead focusing on navigating the busy city streets with the precision that had kept him employed for over 4 decades. "I assure you, Mr. Blackwell, we're making excellent time," Harold replied evenly, his voice betraying none of the hurt he felt. "We'll arrive at your meeting well ahead of schedule." Brandon scoffed, returning his attention to his smartphone. "Whatever, just try not to fall asleep at the wheel, old man." The words stung, but Harold had grown accustomed to them over the years. He'd watched Brandon grow from a spoiled child into an even more spoiled adult, inheriting not just his father's wealth, but also his penchant for cruelty. As they pulled up to a red light, Harold's gaze drifted to a group of pigeons pecking at crumbs on the sidewalk. He envied their simplicity, their freedom from the complexities of human relationships and the pain of ingratitude. The light turned green, and Harold eased the car forward. His mind wandered to happier times, to the days when Brandon's father, the late Richard Blackwell, had treated him with respect and kindness. Richard had understood the value of experience, the wisdom that came with age. But those days were long gone, replaced by constant belittlement and threats of termination. Harold's reverie was interrupted by Brandon's sharp voice. "Hey, Earth to Harold, we're here. Try not to scratch the paint job when you park, will you?" With practiced ease, Harold guided the Rolls-Royce into a prime spot in front of the towering office building. He quickly exited the car, circling around to open Brandon's door. As Brandon stepped out, he straightened his designer suit and fixed Harold with a cold stare. "Wait here, and for heaven's sake, try to look a little more presentable. You're an embarrassment to the Blackwell name." Harold watched as Brandon strode into the building, his shoulders sagging slightly once his employer was out of sight. He leaned against the car, closing his eyes for a moment to collect himself. "Harold, is everything all right?" The gentle voice startled him. He turned to see Emily Blackwell, Brandon's wife, approaching with concern etched on her face. Unlike her husband, Emily had always shown Harold kindness, treating him more like a trusted friend than a servant. "Mrs. Blackwell," Harold said, straightening up. "I didn't expect to see you here." Emily smiled warmly. "I was in the area and thought I'd surprise Brandon for lunch. But never mind that. You look troubled. Has he been giving you a hard time again?" Harold hesitated, torn between his ingrained loyalty and the need to unburden himself. "It's nothing I can't handle, ma'am. Mr. Blackwell is under a lot of pressure." Emily's eyes narrowed. "That's no excuse for mistreating you, Harold. You've been with this family for years. Your experience is invaluable." Before Harold could respond, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Brandon. "Meeting's running long. Take the car back to the house. I'll get a cab." Harold sighed, showing the message to Emily. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwell. It seems your surprise will have to wait." Emily shook her head, a mix of disappointment and frustration crossing her face. Typical Brandon. Always too busy for anything but work. She paused, then asked, "Harold, would you mind giving me a ride home? I'd love to catch up." For the first time that day, Harold felt a genuine smile tugging at his lips. "It would be my pleasure, Mrs. Blackwell." As they settled into the car, Emily turned to Harold with a conspiratorial grin. "You know, I've been thinking. It's about time someone taught Brandon a lesson in respect, and I think I might have an idea." Harold raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite his better judgment. "Oh, and what might that be, Mrs. Blackwell?" Emily leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Well, it all starts with a little something I've hidden in this very car." Emily nodded, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Let's just say, I've been gathering some evidence. But first, tell me more about what's been happening with Brandon lately. As Harold pulled away from the curb, he began to share the daily indignities he faced. The drive home became a cathartic experience, with Emily listening intently and offering words of support. By the time they arrived at the Blackwell mansion, Harold felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Thank you for listening, Mrs. Blackwell," Harold said as he opened her door. "It means more than you know." Emily squeezed his hand. "Harold, your family, and it's high time everyone remembered that." As Emily disappeared into the house, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that change was on the horizon. Little did he know how right he was. The next morning, Brandon stormed out of the house, his face a mask of fury. "Harold, get the car ready, now!" Harold, who had been meticulously polishing the Rolls-Royce, quickly opened the rear door. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell, where are we headed?" "Riverview. I've got a meeting that could make or break the company," Brandon snapped, sliding into the back seat. "And if you make me late, I swear it'll be the last time you ever drive this car." Harold's stomach churned at the threat, but he maintained his composure. "I understand, sir. I'll get you there safely and on time." As they pulled out of the driveway, dark clouds loomed on the horizon. Harold frowned, knowing the forecast had called for severe weather later in the day. He hoped they'd complete their journey before the storm hit. For the first hour of the drive, Brandon was uncharacteristically quiet, furiously tapping away on his tablet. Harold drove in silence, his mind replaying his conversation with Emily the day before. What evidence had she been gathering? And to what end? His thoughts were interrupted by a loud curse from the back seat. "Damn it! Harold, we need to make better time. Can't you go any faster or—" Harold glanced at the speedometer. They were already pushing the speed limit. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm going as fast as is safe given the conditions. The weather seems to be worsening." "I don't pay you to make excuses," Brandon cut him off. "I pay you to drive, so drive." Reluctantly, Harold pressed down on the accelerator. The sky grew darker with each passing mile, and soon fat raindrops began to pelt the windshield. Harold's hands tightened on the wheel as he navigated the increasingly treacherous road. "Mr. Blackwell," Harold ventured, "perhaps we should consider pulling over until the storm passes. It's becoming quite dangerous." "Absolutely not," Brandon roared. "Do you have any idea how important this meeting is? Just keep going. I'm sure even your ancient reflexes can handle a little rain." Harold bit his tongue, focusing all his attention on the road ahead. The rain was now coming down in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. Other cars had slowed to a crawl, their hazard lights blinking urgently in the gloom. Suddenly, through the curtain of rain, Harold spotted a pair of brake lights flaring red directly in front of them. A semi-truck had jackknifed across the highway, its trailer swinging wildly. Time seemed to slow down. Harold's decades of experience kicked in automatically. In one fluid motion, he stomped on the brake while simultaneously turning the wheel, guiding the Rolls-Royce into a controlled slide. Brandon's shout of terror was drowned out by the screech of tires on wet asphalt. The car spun once, twice, narrowly missing the out-of-control truck. With precision born of countless hours behind the wheel, Harold straightened out the vehicle, bringing it to a stop mere inches from the guardrail. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of rain on the roof and their ragged breathing. Then, Brandon spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Harold, you saved my life." Harold turned to face his employer, seeing genuine shock and something else. Was it shame? In the younger man's eyes. "Are you all right, Mr. Blackwell?" Brandon nodded mutely, his face pale. I'm fine, thanks to you." He paused, swallowing hard. "Harold, I owe you an apology. The way I've been treating you. It's inexcusable." Before Harold could respond, a tapping on the window made them both jump. A state trooper peered in, gesturing for them to roll down the window. "Everyone okay in here?" the trooper asked, rain dripping from his hat. "Yes, officer," Harold replied. "We were fortunate." The trooper nodded. "That was some driving, sir. You avoided a major pileup. We're diverting traffic now. You folks might want to find somewhere to wait out this storm." As the trooper walked away, Brandon cleared his throat. "Harold, I think we need to talk. There's a diner about a mile back. Why don't we stop there?" Harold nodded, carefully maneuvering the car off the highway. As they pulled into the diner's parking lot, he couldn't help but wonder, was this near-death experience enough to change Brandon's attitude? Or would the young tycoon revert to his old ways once the shock wore off? With a deep breath, Harold turned off the engine and prepared to face whatever came next. Little did he know, this rain-soaked afternoon was just the beginning of a storm that would change the Blackwell family forever. The bell above the diner door jingled as Harold and Brandon entered, both men dripping water onto the worn linoleum floor. A few patrons looked up from their coffee cups, eyeing the odd pair, one in a soaked designer suit, the other in a chauffeur's uniform. "Table for two," a waitress called out, already reaching for menus. Brandon nodded, following her to a booth by the window. Harold hesitated, unsure if he should join his employer or wait by the car. "Well, come on then," Brandon said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Unless you'd rather stand there catching pneumonia." Surprised, Harold slid into the booth. The waitress returned, pouring them each a cup of steaming coffee. "You boys look like you could use this. Ready to order, or do you need a minute?" "Just the coffee for now, thank you," Brandon replied, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. As the waitress walked away, an awkward silence fell between them. Harold sipped his coffee, stealing glances at Brandon, who seemed lost in thought as he stared out at the rain-lashed parking lot. Finally, Brandon spoke. "I could have died today." Harold nodded solemnly. "It was a close call, sir." "No," Brandon shook his head, meeting Harold's eyes. "I could have died, and my last words to you would have been insults, threats." He ran a hand through his damp hair. "Christ, what kind of person does that make me?" Harold remained silent, unsure how to respond. He'd never seen Brandon like this, vulnerable, introspective. "How long have you been with the family, Harold?" Brandon asked suddenly. 43 years this June, sir." Brandon's eyes widened. 40? That's longer than I've been alive." He paused, a rueful smile touching his lips. "You must have some stories." For the next hour, as the storm raged outside, Harold shared tales of his years with the Blackwell family. He spoke of Brandon's grandfather, a self-made man with a booming laugh and a heart of gold. Of Brandon's father, Richard, who'd treated Harold like a trusted friend rather than an employee. As Harold talked, he saw something change in Brandon's eyes. The arrogance, the disdain, they melted away, replaced by curiosity, and Harold dared to hope, a growing respect. "I had no idea," Brandon said softly when Harold finished. "All these years, and I never bothered to ask." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Harold, I'm sorry, truly. The way I've treated you, it's unforgivable." Harold felt a lump form in his throat. "Mr. Blackwell, Please," Brandon interrupted. "Call me Brandon. After everything, well, I think we're past formalities." Harold nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Very well. Brandon." As the rain began to let up, Brandon's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at Harold. "That's the office. The meeting's been rescheduled for tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "What do you say we head back? I think I need to have a long talk with Emily." The drive back to the Blackwell mansion was markedly different from their earlier journey. Brandon sat in the front passenger seat, continuing their conversation. He asked Harold about his family, his life outside of work, questions he'd never bothered with before. As they pulled into the driveway, Emily burst out of the house, her face etched with worry. "Brandon, Harold, thank God you're all right. I heard about the pileup on the news, and when you weren't answering your phone..." Brandon enveloped his wife in a tight hug. "We're okay, Em. Thanks to Harold." He pulled back, looking into Emily's eyes. "We need to talk about a lot of things." Emily's gaze flicked to Harold, a question in her eyes. Harold gave her a small nod, and she smiled. "Yes, I think we do. Harold, why don't you join us?" Inside, as they sat in the study, Brandon recounted the harrowing events on the highway. Emily listened intently, her hand clasped tightly in her husband's. I've been a real bastard," Brandon concluded. "To Harold, to you, to everyone. It stops now." He turned to Harold. "I know I can't undo years of mistreatment overnight, but I want to make things right, whatever it takes." Emily squeezed Brandon's hand, then stood up. I think it's time I showed you both something. She walked to a cabinet and pulled out a laptop. I hoped I wouldn't need to use this, but she opened the computer and turned it to face them. On the screen was a video feed of the interior of the Rolls-Royce. Brandon's face paled as he watched himself on the screen, hurling insults at Harold. You've been recording? Brandon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded. For months. I couldn't stand by and watch how you treated Harold, how you treated everyone. I thought if I had evidence, maybe I could make you see. Brandon slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions clearly crushing him. You shouldn't have had to do that, Em. I should have been better. He looked at Harold, his eyes filled with remorse. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I swear things will change. Harold, who had been quiet throughout this exchange, finally spoke. Mr. Blah, Brandon, I've watched you grow from a boy to a man. I've seen the good in you, even when you couldn't see it yourself. It's not too late to be the man your father always believed you could be. Brandon nodded, wiping at his eyes. Thank you, Harold. I promise, I won't let you down again. He turned to Emily. Either of you. As the evening wore on, the three of them talked long into the night. Plans were made, apologies offered, and a new understanding reached. By the time Harold left for his own home, he felt a cautious optimism blooming in his chest. The next morning, as Harold pulled up to the mansion, he was surprised to see Brandon waiting outside. Good morning, Harold, Brandon greeted him with a smile. I hope you don't mind, but I thought I might drive us today. Harold raised an eyebrow. Are you sure, sir? I mean, Brandon? Brandon nodded, his expression serious. Absolutely. In fact, I was hoping you might teach me a thing or two about defensive driving. After yesterday, well, I realized I have a lot to learn. As they switched places, Harold couldn't help but marvel at the change in Brandon. He knew there would be challenges ahead. Old habits die hard, after all. But for the first time in years, he felt hope for the future of the Blackwell family. Little did he know, the biggest changes were yet to come. As the weeks passed, the change in Brandon Blackwell became the talk of the town. Employees who had once cowered at his approach now found themselves greeted with smiles and genuine interest in their work. The tension that had permeated the Blackwell Industries offices began to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of camaraderie and purpose. Harold, for his part, found his role evolving in ways he never could have imagined. No longer just a chauffeur, he became Brandon's trusted advisor, offering insights gleaned from decades of observing the family's business dealings. One sunny morning, as Harold drove Brandon to a board meeting, the young CEO turned to him with a thoughtful expression. Harold, I've been thinking, we need to do more. Harold glanced at him in the rearview mirror. More, sir. Brandon nodded, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. Yes, you see, what happened to me, this wake-up call, it's made me realize how many other companies must be in the same boat. How many experienced workers are being overlooked or pushed out because of their age? Harold remained silent, allowing Brandon to continue. I want to start a program, Brandon went on. A mentorship initiative that pairs older employees with younger ones, not just in our company, but across the industry. Think about it, all that knowledge, all those years of experience being passed down instead of cast aside. Harold felt a warmth spreading in his chest. That sounds like a wonderful idea, Brandon. Your father would have been proud. Brandon smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. I wish he could see this. But Harold, I want you to be a key part of this program. Your experience, your patience, we need more of that in the corporate world. As they pulled up to the office building, Brandon placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. What do you say? Will you help me make this happen? Harold nodded, emotion making it hard to speak. It would be my honor, sir. The board meeting that day was unlike any other in Blackwell Industries history. Brandon presented his vision for the mentorship program with a passion that left the room stunned. There were skeptics, of course, those who questioned the cost, the logistics, the potential impact on the bottom line. But Brandon was prepared. With Harold by his side, he laid out a comprehensive plan that addressed every concern. By the end of the meeting, Even the most hardened critics were nodding in agreement. As they left the boardroom, Brandon turned to Harold with a grin. "We did it. But this is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Over the next few months, Harold found himself busier than he'd been in years. While he still drove Brandon on occasion, much of his time was now spent helping to develop the mentorship program. He worked closely with HR to identify potential mentors and mentees, designed training modules, and even led some of the sessions himself. The program, dubbed Wisdom Bridge, quickly gained traction within Blackwell Industries. Older employees who had been considering retirement found new purpose in sharing their knowledge. Younger workers, initially skeptical, soon came to value the insights their mentors provided. Word of the program's success spread beyond the company. Other businesses began to take notice, reaching out to Brandon for advice on implementing similar initiatives. Harold often found himself accompanying Brandon to speaking engagements, sharing his own experiences and the transformative power of intergenerational collaboration. One evening, as they returned from one such event, Brandon turned to Harold with a serious expression. "Harold, there's something I need to discuss with you." Harold felt a flicker of concern. Despite the positive changes of the past months, old habits died hard, and he couldn't help but worry. "Is everything all right, sir?" Brandon nodded, a smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "More than all right. Harold, I want to offer you a new position. How would you feel about becoming the Director of Intergenerational Initiatives for Blackwell Industries?" Harold blinked, stunned. "Director? But sir, I'm just a chauffeur." "No," Brandon interrupted gently. "You're so much more than that. You're the heart of this company, Harold. The living embodiment of the wisdom and experience we're trying to preserve and pass on. We need you in this role." Tears pricked at Harold's eyes. I don't know what to say." Brandon squeezed his shoulder. "Say yes. We'll figure out the details together. And don't worry. If you ever feel the need to get behind the wheel again, I'm sure we can arrange that too." As they pulled into the driveway of the Blackwell mansion, Harold saw Emily waiting on the front steps, a broad smile on her face. She must have known about Brandon's plan. "Well," she called out as they approached, "did he say yes?" Harold looked from Emily to Brandon, overwhelmed by the trust and affection he saw in their eyes. This was more than a job offer. It was an acknowledgement of his worth, a testament to how far they'd all come. "Yes," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I accept." Emily clapped her hands in delight while Brandon beamed. "Excellent. We'll make the announcement tomorrow, but for now, I think this calls for a celebration. Emily, is dinner ready?" As they headed inside, Harold couldn't help but marvel at the turn his life had taken. From a chauffeur on the verge of being fired to a key player in a revolutionary corporate initiative, all because of one rainy day and a near miss on the highway. But as they settled around the dining table, Harold realized it was more than that. It was about second chances, about seeing the value in every person, regardless of age or position. And as Brandon raised a toast to new beginnings, Harold felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Little did they know, their story was about to inspire a movement that would reshape the corporate landscape far beyond the walls of Blackwell Industries. As news of Blackwell Industries' Wisdom Bridge program spread, it sparked a nationwide conversation about age diversity in the workplace. Harold found himself at the center of this movement, his story serving as a powerful testament to the value of experience and the potential for change. Media outlets clamored for interviews, eager to hear from the chauffeur-turned-executive who had inspired such a dramatic shift in corporate culture. At first, Harold was hesitant, uncomfortable with the spotlight, but Brandon and Emily encouraged him, reminding him of the impact his story could have. One crisp autumn morning, Harold found himself in a television studio, preparing for a live interview on a popular morning show. As the makeup artist applied final touches, he could feel his heart racing. "You'll do great, Harold," Brandon reassured him, having insisted on accompanying him for moral support. "Just be yourself. That's what people want to hear." The lights flared, and Harold found himself face to face with the show's host, a friendly-faced woman named Sarah. "So Harold," Sarah began. "Tell us about your journey. How does one go from being a chauffeur to a director at one of the country's largest corporations?" Harold took a deep breath, then began to share his story. He spoke of the years of mistreatment, the near accident that changed everything, and the transformation he'd witnessed in Brandon and the company. As he talked, he could see the studio crew leaning in, captivated. Sarah's eyes glistened with emotion. "What an incredible story," she said when he finished. "But Harold, what would you say to companies that are hesitant to implement similar programs? Those who might see older workers as a liability rather than an asset?" Harold leaned forward, his voice firm. "I'd say they're missing out on their greatest resource. Experience isn't a liability. It's a treasure trove of knowledge waiting to be tapped. When you bridge the gap between generations, you're not just helping older workers, you're enriching your entire organization." The interview was a resounding success. Within hours, clips were going viral on social media, with thousands sharing their own stories of age discrimination and calling for change. Back at Blackwell Industries, Harold's inbox was flooded with messages from people across the country. Some shared their own experiences of feeling pushed out of their jobs due to age. Others, younger workers, expressed newfound appreciation for their older colleagues. But it was one email in particular that caught Harold's attention. It was from a man named Frank, the CEO of a rival company. "Mr. Thorne," the email read, "I must admit, I was skeptical when I first heard about your program. But after seeing your interview, I realize we've been making a grave mistake in our own company. I'd like to meet with you and Mr. Blackwell to discuss how we might implement something similar. Your story has opened my eyes, and I suspect I'm not the only one." Harold shared the email with Brandon, who grinned broadly. "You see, Harold, this is exactly what we hoped for. We're starting a movement." Over the next few months, Harold and Brandon found themselves traveling across the country, consulting with companies eager to launch their own mentorship programs. They spoke at conferences, sat on panels, and even testified before a congressional committee on age discrimination in the workplace. Through it all, Harold never lost sight of where he'd come from. He made a point of spending time with the chauffeurs and maintenance staff at every company they visited, ensuring their voices were heard in the development of new programs. As winter turned to spring, Blackwell Industries hosted a gala to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the Wisdom Bridge program. The ballroom was packed with employees, business leaders, and media personalities, all eager to hear about the program's success. Brandon took the stage, his face beaming with pride. "A year ago, we embarked on a journey to change the way we view experience in the workplace. Today, I'm thrilled to announce that not only has our program been a resounding success within our own company, but we've also helped implement similar initiatives in over 100 companies nationwide." The room erupted in applause. Brandon raised his hand for quiet. "But none of this would have been possible without one man. A man who showed me the error of my ways and inspired a change that has touched thousands of lives. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage the heart and soul of Wisdom Bridge, Mr. Harold Thorne." As Harold made his way to the podium, the crowd rose to their feet. The applause was deafening, and Harold felt tears pricking at his eyes. He saw Emily in the front row, beaming up at him. And there, at the back of the room, stood a group of chauffeurs and maintenance staff, cheering loudly for one of their own. Harold cleared his throat, overwhelmed by the moment. "A year ago, I was just a chauffeur, hanging onto my job by a thread. Today, I stand before you not as a success story, but as a reminder that wisdom doesn't have an expiration date, that every person, regardless of age or position, has value to bring to the table." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "This program, this movement, it's not about me. It's about all of us. It's about creating workplaces where experience is cherished, where different generations learn from each other, where no one is made to feel obsolete." As Harold continued his speech, he couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought him here. From the lonely nights behind the wheel, enduring Brandon's verbal abuse, to this moment of triumph and vindication. But even as he basked in the glow of success, Harold knew their work was far from over. There were still companies resistant to change, still older workers struggling to find their place in a rapidly evolving job market. As he concluded his speech, Harold made a silent vow. He would continue to fight, to share his story, to be a voice for those who felt voiceless. The road ahead might be long, but with Brandon and Emily by his side and a growing army of supporters behind him, Harold knew that real, lasting change was possible. The applause washed over him as he left the stage, but it was the quiet words of a young valet that touched him most deeply. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," the young man said, his eyes shining. "You've given people like my dad hope again." Harold squeezed the young man's shoulder, a lump forming in his throat. This, he realized, was what it was all about. Not the accolades or the fancy title, but the real, tangible impact on people's lives. As the gala wound down, Brandon approached Harold with a mischievous glint in his eye. "So, Harold," he said, "ready for our next big adventure?" Harold raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what might that be?" Brandon grinned. "Well, I was thinking, why stop at age diversity? There's so much more we could do." Brandon's words sparked a new fire in Harold. As they delved into discussions about expanding their initiatives, it became clear that age was just the tip of the iceberg. There were so many other forms of diversity that needed addressing in the corporate world. Over the next year, Blackwell Industries became a beacon of inclusive practices. Under Harold and Brandon's guidance, they launched programs focusing on gender equality, racial diversity, and opportunities for differently abled individuals. The Wisdom Bridge evolved into a comprehensive diversity and inclusion department, with Harold at its helm. One crisp autumn morning, exactly 2 years after the fateful car ride that had changed everything, Harold found himself back behind the wheel of the Rolls-Royce. But this time, it wasn't just Brandon in the back seat. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Harold asked, glancing in the rearview mirror at Brandon and the nervous-looking young man beside him. Brandon nodded, a reassuring smile on his face. "Absolutely, Harold. Jamal here is the perfect candidate for our new executive training program. I thought you might like to give him the same tour of the city you gave me all those years ago." Jamal, a bright-eyed recent graduate from a local community college, looked out the window in awe as Harold navigated the streets of the financial district. "I never thought I'd be here," he admitted softly. "Kids from my neighborhood. We don't usually end up in places like this." "Neither did kids from mine," Harold replied with a warm smile. "But times are changing, Jamal, and you're part of that change." As they drove, Brandon explained the company's history, pointing out landmarks and sharing anecdotes. But it was Harold's quiet wisdom that seemed to resonate most with Jamal. The young man peppered him with questions about his journey, his eyes wide with admiration. Returning to Blackwell Industries, they found the lobby buzzing with excitement. Emily rushed up to them, her face flushed. "You're just in time. The results are in." They hurried to the conference room, where a large screen displayed a live feed of a National Business Awards ceremony. The room fell silent as the announcer opened an envelope. "And the award for Most Inclusive Workplace of the Year goes to Blackwell Industries." The room erupted in cheers. Brandon hugged Emily tightly, then turned to embrace Harold. "We did it, old friend. We really did it." As the celebration continued around them, Harold felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Jamal, his eyes shining. "Mr. Thorne, I just wanted to say thank you for showing people like me that we belong here too." Harold felt his throat tighten with emotion. This, he realized, was his true legacy. Not the awards or the accolades, but the lives he'd touched, the doors he'd helped open. In the weeks that followed, Harold found himself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past 2 years. From a chauffeur on the brink of being fired to a respected executive and champion of workplace diversity, it was almost too much to believe. One evening, as he was preparing to leave the office, he found Brandon waiting by his car. "Harold," Brandon said, his voice serious, "there's something I need to discuss with you." For a moment, old fears flickered in Harold's mind, but Brandon's warm smile quickly dispelled them. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Brandon continued, "about the future of the company, about legacy." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Harold, I want you to take over as CEO of Blackwell Industries. Harold stared at him, speechless. But, sir, I'm not. Brandon held up a hand. You're exactly what this company needs, Harold. Your wisdom, your compassion, your ability to bring people together, that's the future of business. I'll still be involved as chairman of the board, but it's time for a new vision to lead us forward. Your vision. Tears welled in Harold's eyes as the magnitude of the moment washed over him. From behind the wheel to behind the desk, it was a journey he never could have imagined. I don't know what to say, Harold stammered. Brandon clasped his shoulder. Say yes, Harold. The company needs you. Heck, the world needs more leaders like you. As Harold nodded, accepting this new challenge, he couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns of life. He thought of the lonely nights driving in silence, of the insults and the threats. But he also thought of the near miss on the highway, of Emily's kindness, of Brandon's transformation. Every moment, every hardship had led to this. The announcement of Harold's promotion sent shockwaves through the business world. Some critics scoffed at the idea of a former chauffeur leading a Fortune 500 company. But those who had witnessed Blackwell Industries' transformation over the past 2 years knew better. Under Harold's leadership, the company soared to new heights. His unique perspective and commitment to inclusivity attracted top talent from all walks of life. Profits increased, but more importantly, Blackwell Industries became a model for ethical, inclusive business practices. 5 years after that rainy day that had changed everything, Harold stood at a podium, addressing a graduating class at his old community college. As he looked out at the sea of eager young faces, he felt a profound sense of responsibility and hope. When I was your age, he began, I never dreamed I'd be standing here today. I was just a young man with a driver's license and a determination to work hard. But life has a way of surprising us. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the auditorium. Your path may not be straight. There will be detours, roadblocks, and times when you feel like turning back. But remember this, every experience, every challenge, is shaping you for something greater. As he continued his speech, Harold caught sight of Brandon and Emily in the audience, beaming with pride. Beside them sat Jamal, now a rising star in the company's marketing department. And there, in the back row, was a group of chauffeurs from Blackwell Industries, who had insisted on coming to support their former colleague. The world is changing, Harold concluded, and you, each and every one of you, have the power to shape that change. Embrace your uniqueness, value your experiences, both good and bad. And never, ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong. As applause filled the auditorium, Harold felt a sense of completion. His journey had come full circle, from a struggling student in those very halls to a leader inspiring the next generation. But even as he basked in the moment, Harold knew this wasn't the end. It was simply another bend in the road, another chapter in an ongoing story, a story of transformation, of second chances, and of the profound impact one person can have when given the opportunity to shine. As he left the stage, Harold's mind was already racing with new ideas, new ways to make a difference. The journey, he realized with a smile, was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.